We have this study popped out. This is from SciPost. Says higher protein consumption is associated with lower levels of depressive symptoms, study finds. A study in Switzerland found that adolescent athletes, this is a very specific group of people, adolescent athletes who consumed more protein in their diets had lower levels of depressive symptoms. The study was published in Psychology of Sports and Exercise. The food we eat is comprised of different components. These include so-called macronutrients such as carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. You mentioned those, but also micronutrients such as vitamins and minerals. Macronutrients are nutrients that humans need a lot of, while micronutrients, as the name would imply, are needed in relatively small amounts. Both types of nutrients are essential for our health and well-being. Results showed that at the start of the study, 13.9% of the participants reported moderate to severe levels of depressive symptoms. At the second assessment, roughly a year later, that percentage was 11.4. But it's only 11 versus 9 participants. So this is not a large study.
No.
Okay. You snickering. Joyce, tell me about macronutrients. You said a little bit already, but go for it.
So I think the big thing that people look at are the protein. How much protein do you need? The one thing you have to be careful, somebody that has renal failure or issues with their kidneys, they shouldn't eat a lot of protein because it's harder to break down, and that can raise their creatinine and lower their GFR, which is the fluid filtered per minute through your kidneys.
Okay.
So, but just as a rule of thumb, and you can do this in kilo weight or pound weight, and it's usually, a pound per 1 pound per kilo of protein that's necessary. Some people use a half. So everybody's a little bit different. But there's a range, 0.8 to 1.8 grams of protein per kilo, basically, per pound. What's per pound? So you just do one. I think one's easy. Like say you eat 65. If you're like 140 pounds or something, maybe you'll get 65 grams of protein a day. And that's the baseline. If somebody wants to try to gain weight and do better, if they're been in the hospital for a long time, lots of times their protein drops and their albumin drops, like with cancer that happens, then you try to get like our protein smoothies. That has 20 to 30 grams of protein depending on how much you use. But it's a higher amount of protein, low amount of carbs that people can consume, and it'll really help their overall health. So
all right. Are there normal recommended ratios for macronutrients other than just we should probably eat some more protein?
Ranges.
They range.
There definitely are some ranges that we could recommend for a lot of people. That's a cart before the horse kind of thing, potentially.
Okay.
Even just, working with the number of calories in general can be a lot. Just, again, just depending on the motivation of the person, where they sit, are they just getting out of the hospital? Right. Are they going to be worried about
all the different situations,
these numbers and such? So looking at first of all, looking at your total caloric intake, even before protein or at the same time as looking at protein, is absolutely critical.
Okay.
Just as far as knowing, where do you sit, at your current body weight level? Do you need to lose weight? Are you okay at maintenance? Do you need to are you somebody that needs to gain weight?
Right.
Starting there and then shooting for that 1 gram per pound is just, if you notice, we trimmed a lot of numbers there.
Yeah.
And that's not like a hard roll necessarily, but it is somewhere in the middle of many of the recommendations that are out there.
Right.
So 1 gram per pound for somebody that's 150 pounds, 140 pounds, they're only used to eating 60 grams a day.
Yeah.
To then double your increase.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
It's very difficult. And that's daunting when you have to grocery shop. That's daunting when you actually sit down and you look at this meal in front of you of all this meat or all this yogurt or protein
if they can't
powder.
Eat, they're not hungry, you don't have an appetite.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. There's so much there. So I hate, sometimes with the numbers and the ratios and the percentages, sometimes you just get it's so easy. It's 40. What do you mean? Just eat 40% of your calories from carbohydrates. That's enough to perform well and do what you got to do. And then 20% from fat, that's safe. As much as we want to recommend that and want to follow that, it is hard. It is hard. So at least if you are the person that says, the heck with it, I'm going to do it. I want to know exactly where I sit from a numbers perspective. Again, you get that total number of calories. How do you get that number of calories? One of the best recommendations I have for doing so, I mean, there are apps out there, food tracking apps that will help you through this. But the NIH, the National Institute of Health, they have something that's called the Body Weight Planner. And you go on and you answer a few questions, you plug in a few spots, you give it your goal, basically. You tell it how much rough activity you carry out on a daily basis, and then it'll spit out a rough calorie range of what it would take for you to maintain your weight, what it would take for you to lose a pound per week, 1 pound per week or 2 pounds per week or whatever. So
it's a lot of tracking.
It's a lot of tracking, but filling it out is very easy. And at least if you want a number, it'll give you the number. And, there's a lot of variation in these numbers. It's, individuals' physiologies will play a role here.
Right.
This is going to be a rough estimate.
Yeah.
But again, this is just the starting point.
Yeah.
So then once you have that number, like Joyce said, we shoot for the 1 gram per pound, or maybe a little less, which is a little bit less is fine too. Again, especially as
probably more than what they're getting.
Anything, right. Generally, it's going to be more than what they're getting. And if you're shooting for, 20, 30, 40 grams potentially of protein per meal, if you eat 3 or 4 meals per day and maybe a snack, let's say, that gets you pretty darn close, right? So 20 to 40 grams of protein per meal from higher quality sources. You got your total number of calories. And then that's when you can start to, focus on the other macronutrients. Right. And to neatly summarize that, the carbohydrate and fat portion, the 2 remaining macronutrients, I think that's where a lot more personal preference comes in.
Okay.
And so, for example, if somebody likes to have a little more fat in their diet or a little less fat in their diet, or they are an endurance athlete and they prefer a little bit of a higher carbohydrate intake,
right?
That's when you can see that John over here has 45% of his calories or 50% of his calories from carbohydrates because he's a runner. And then you have Jane over here who, having a little bit of extra fat, avocados, nuts. Neil, he's maybe on that side of the spectrum.
Yep.
They shift to 20 to 30% of their calories from fat. And so I wouldn't get lost.
Okay.
In that we could give you more
Don't
ranges
focus
for that.
on the macros specifically.
Yeah, it's tough. Again, it boils down to the specific individual and what amount of meticulous tracking they're going to be looking for.
Yeah.
And then lastly, what will help you kind of square the circle would be how do I get these micronutrients? How do I ensure that I'm getting enough micronutrients?
Right.
So if you aim for foods that need cooked, you aim for whole foods, the minimally processed foods, kind of, again, those stock recommendations that we continue to make time and time again.
Yep.
As you focus on those, you'll notice that things will automatically start to come together for you. You'll be hitting a reasonable amount of carbohydrates if that's what you're focusing on. Like,
right.
how am I going to get these micronutrients? They're coming from whole foods without laundry lists of
food is medicine.
Yeah.
They're coming from there's not 100 ingredients on the package list. And that, again, just helps you worry less about, is it 25%, 30%, 42%?
Right.
Just picking foods from the right categories can help you fill out the rest of your goals, knowing that you picked your total calorie intake, knowing that you are getting close to your protein goals.
Okay, so pulling it back for a second, because we went deep into macronutrients. We're not talking about the study here.
I know.
Why aren't we talking about the study, Dante? You can reduce depression in elite adolescent athletes if they just eat more protein.
Yeah, I wish. I mean, it's a fascinating study, mechanistically. It makes sense as to why they would want to look at something like this.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at in a very rudimentary way, you look at the makeup of neurotransmitters, you have these amino acids, you need adequate dietary protein to then have a adequate
amino
pool.
acids.
You need to have an amino acid pool to pull from to carry out the various metabolic processes in the body, including neurotransmitter production in the brain. And so, in a very crude reductionist way, you could see where this way of thinking comes in. But just to even jump to the limitations here, you see that they didn't really focus on their overall dietary pattern.
Right.
So
Yeah.
No.
So I guess like how much can you really take from this besides we need a randomized control trial, we need some form of random, better methods, some better form of randomization to parse out details like this. Is there a minor correlation here? I guess, but again, they're not looking at these individuals' overall dietary pattern. This could be attributed to a handful of things as far as the symptom reduction goes, right?
And the one thing I always say, athletes in general, especially elite athletes, they have bad guts.
Mm-hmm.
They have intestinal permeability and everything else, and they don't absorb nutrients well, especially runners,
Really?
And yes. So, they don't absorb nutrients. So then those nutrients, like Dante said, amino acids, they don't absorb the amino acids, and that's what makes up neurotransmitters.
Okay.
And, 70, 90% of serotonin, which is a calming neurotransmitter, is made in the gut. And if you have a bad gut, you're going to have depression.
Interesting. So why is what is the relation between athletes and high performance
They
athletes?
really high stress their bodies.
Oh, wow.
A lot of stress on their bodies.
Yeah. And Joyce, that's an interesting point because I wasn't going to necessarily bring this up in that direct context, but not only are they high performers, elite athletes, but they're young people.
Yeah.
And
with bad guts.
that's right. They're young people under high amounts of stress competing.
Yeah. That's a good point too.
And
a lot of times they're given steroids because of their injuries, and that doesn't help your gut either.
Wow.
For sure.
Injections.
For sure. It's just that these sort of symptoms, depression, anxiety, it's not a lot of this is not it's not happening in a vacuum.
Right.
And so even though they're a part of the same group, they're on the same team, training at the same facility, you're having 9, 11, 20 different experiences here.
The difference between 11 and 9 is not a lot. And and that, a flip of the coin could change that.
Yeah.
Okay. So this study is just not really terribly helpful.
Yeah. And I think, the problem is it's not that it's void of utility. It's just that adolescents in general, let alone high performing, elite athlete adolescents, they just don't typically pay as close attention to these, healthy dietary patterns because they're worried about 9,000 other things. I'm, practically 30. We're all older. We've had plenty of time to think about these things. They're worried about their score. They're worried about the score of the game, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I'm just,
that's a lot of stress.
It's a lot of stress. And I'm just not so sure that even though they are elite, how many things can they kind of worry about? They're still from as far as I can tell, it's like they're still in a learning process here.
If they're adolescents, then that's high school. That's, you're dealing with tests and you're dealing with a boyfriend or a girlfriend and mom's mad at me or whatever. I can understand why all of those things compiled, especially with the high performance athletics element of it, would be questionable on this front. All right. So fine. We'll just ignore it then. Moving on. You should eat more protein.